The new guy spent his whole lunch break telling me the owner probably inherited everything and never earned anything, unaware I was his boss and I built it from nothing. I walked into the construction site trailer at noon, carrying a thermos of coffee and a lunch my daughter had packed that morning, wearing the same steel-toed boots and faded work jacket I'd worn for 20 years. The place smelled like sawdust and diesel fuel, familiar scents that reminded me why I loved this business despite everything it had cost me. I'd founded this commercial construction company in 2003 with money I'd saved from working 3 jobs simultaneously, building it from a 2-person operation into a firm that employed 87 people and handled projects across 6 states. My clothes were covered in drywall dust from inspecting the 4th floor that morning, and I had concrete residue under my fingernails that wouldn't come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. Nobody looking at me would guess I owned the company, which was exactly how I preferred it when I visited job sites unannounced. The trailer's break area was crowded with workers grabbing quick meals before the afternoon push. I spotted an open seat at the corner table and sat down next to a guy I didn't recognize, someone who must have been hired recently by one of my site supervisors. He was maybe 25 with an expensive haircut and clothes that looked too clean for someone who'd been working construction all morning. His boots were brand new without a single scuff mark, and his work gloves sat on the table still creased from the packaging. I nodded hello and opened my thermos while he continued talking to 2 framers across from us about some sports controversy I didn't follow. The conversation was ordinary enough until the new guy, whose temporary badge read Kyle Brennan, suddenly shifted topics and started talking about the company owner. Kyle launched into a monologue about how the owner had probably inherited the business from his father and had never actually worked construction a day in his life. The 2 framers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but didn't contradict him, probably not wanting to start conflict with someone they barely knew. I kept my expression neutral and took a bite of my sandwich while Kyle described in vivid detail how he imagined my background. According to him, I was some trust fund kid who'd been handed a successful company and just coasted on the hard work of real construction workers who actually understood the trade. He said owners like that were what was wrong with the industry, people who'd never swung a hammer or poured concrete, but felt entitled to profits built on other people's labor and expertise. And one of the framers mentioned quietly that he'd heard the owner had actually started the company himself, but Kyle dismissed this immediately. He said that's what rich people always claim to make themselves look self-made, but the reality was always family, connections, and inherited money. I took another bite of my sandwich and let him continue, curious how far he'd take this fictional narrative. Kyle was warming up now, his voice getting louder with each assertion. He said he'd researched the company before taking the job and couldn't find much information about the owner's background online, which he claimed proved the guy was hiding his privileged origins. The irony was that I kept a low online profile intentionally because I valued privacy and believed my work should speak louder than self-promotion. Kyle went on to say that the owner probably drove a luxury car and lived in some gated community, completely disconnected from the reality of what happened on actual construction sites. He complained that management didn't understand how hard the work was or appreciate the skill involved in what they did every day. This part stung because I'd spent 15 years doing every job in this company before I could afford to hire help. I'd worked as a framer, a concrete finisher, an electrician's assistant, and a site cleanup crew. I'd broken 3 fingers, dislocated my shoulder twice, and had permanent hearing damage in my left ear from years of working around heavy machinery before OSHA regulations got stricter. But Kyle had constructed this entire fantasy about silver spoon privilege that had nothing to do with my actual life. He started listing specific complaints about company policies, including our safety requirements that he called excessive, and our documentation standards that he claimed were just bureaucratic nonsense. Kyle said a real construction worker didn't need to fill out forms and reports, they just needed to get the work done efficiently. I knew those safety requirements had been implemented after we'd had a serious fall incident 5 years ago that had nearly killed one of my best foremen. The documentation standards existed because we'd been burned by subcontractors who'd cut corners and cost us a major client contract. Every policy Kyle was dismissing had been created in response to real problems that had real consequences, but he didn't have that context or apparently any interest in understanding why things worked the way they did. One of the framers tried to change the subject by asking about the afternoon schedule, but Kyle ignored him and kept talking about the owner. He said he'd worked for several construction companies over the past 3 years and could always tell which ones were run by people who actually knew the business versus inherited rich kids playing entrepreneur. He placed our company firmly in the second category based on absolutely nothing but his assumptions. Kyle claimed the owner probably had an MBA from some expensive university and had never gotten his hands dirty in his life. I'd actually dropped out of community college after 1 semester because I couldn't afford tuition and had to work full-time to help my mother pay rent after my father died. But, again, I didn't correct his wildly inaccurate assumptions. Kyle shifted to complaining about his pay rate, saying it was insulting given his experience and skills. He'd been hired 2 weeks ago at a rate that was actually 15% above market average for his position, something I knew because I personally reviewed all compensation packages. He claimed the owner was probably pocketing excessive profits while underpaying the workers who actually generated the revenue. In reality, our profit margins were tight because I reinvested heavily in equipment, training, and competitive wages. Last year, I'd taken a pay cut myself to avoid laying anyone off during a slow quarter. But Kyle had decided I was some greedy parasite, and facts apparently didn't matter when weighed against a satisfying narrative of class resentment. The two framers were actively trying to leave now, gathering their trash and checking their watches. One of them mentioned he needed to get back to work, and Kyle barely acknowledged him leaving. He immediately turned his attention to me and asked how long I'd been with the company. I told him 6 months, which was technically true since I'd been on this particular project site for that duration. Kyle nodded knowingly and said that made sense because I seemed like someone who actually understood construction work. He said it was guys like us who kept these companies running while owners sat in air-conditioned offices and took credit for our accomplishments. I asked him what made him think the owner didn't work on sites, and Kyle laughed like I'd said something naive. He explained that owners never actually showed up to job sites, or if they did, it was just for photo opportunities with hard hats they'd never worn before that day. Kyle said he'd never once seen the owner here, which proved the guy had no real connection to the work being done. The truth was, I'd been on this site every Tuesday and Thursday for the past month, including this morning when I'd spent 3 hours reviewing structural issues on the upper floors. But I'd been wearing the same dusty work clothes I had on now, and Kyle had apparently walked right past me multiple times without registering my presence. He saw what he expected to see, just another older worker in dirty clothes, someone beneath his notice until he needed an audience for his complaints. Kyle started talking about his previous jobs and how he'd left each one because management didn't appreciate his contributions. He'd worked for a residential builder who he claimed was disorganized and cheap. Then a commercial renovations company where the owner played favorites and didn't reward merit. Then a municipal construction contractor where he said the bureaucracy was suffocating. I was starting to see a pattern where Kyle found fault with every employer and never questioned whether he might be part of the problem. He described himself as someone with high standards who refused to settle for mediocre leadership, but it sounded more like someone who couldn't maintain employment anywhere for more than 8 months. He asked me if I'd ever thought about starting my own construction company, and I told him I was happy with my current situation. Kyle looked at me with something resembling pity and said that was the problem with our generation. We'd accepted crumbs from owners who'd inherited everything while we did all the actual work. He couldn't have been more than 5 years younger than me, but he'd decided I represented some defeated older worker who'd given up on ambition. He said if he had the capital, he'd start his own company and run it the right way, treating workers with respect and sharing profits fairly. I asked him what was stopping him from saving up the capital, and Kyle laughed again like I didn't understand how the world worked. He explained that guys like us could never accumulate enough money to start a real business because we were paid just enough to survive, but never enough to build wealth. The system was designed to keep workers in their place while owners maintained their inherited advantages. Kyle's certainty about this was impressive, given that he had no idea about my actual financial history. I'd started this company with $12,000 saved from working 3 jobs simultaneously for 4 years. I'd slept in my truck for 18 months to avoid rent. I'd eaten ramen noodles and gas station coffee for years while I built a client base and reputation. Every dollar I made went back into equipment and paying workers until the company was stable enough to support a modest salary for myself. Kyle continued his lunch break lecture about class inequality and inherited privilege, apparently forgetting he was supposed to be working. I glanced at my watch and noted he was now 20 minutes past the standard break time. He noticed me checking the time and said management was always obsessed with clocking every minute, like they owned your entire life just because they paid your wage. He said at his last job they'd written him up for extended breaks, which he claimed was petty micromanagement. I made a mental note that this was apparently a recurring pattern. Kyle seemed to believe rules about break times and schedules were personal affronts rather than basic operational necessities on construction sites where timing and coordination mattered. He started talking about the company's recent expansion into the neighboring state, which he'd somehow heard about despite being here only 2 weeks. Kyle said it was proof the owner was getting greedy and overextending, chasing profits without caring if it stretched resources too thin or put current projects at risk. The reality was I'd spent 8 months carefully researching that expansion, building relationships with local contractors and suppliers, and ensuring we had the infrastructure to support additional projects without compromising existing commitments. The new contracts had been structured to minimize risk and provide steady work for our crews during traditionally slow seasons. But Kyle had reduced all that planning to simple greed because it fit his predetermined narrative. I asked Kyle what he'd do differently if he were running the company, genuinely curious about his answer. He said first he'd cut all the unnecessary bureaucracy and paperwork that slowed everything down. He'd trust workers to do their jobs without constant oversight and documentation. He'd pay everyone 20% more and take a smaller profit margin. He'd bid projects more aggressively to undercut competitors. Every suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how construction businesses actually operated. The paperwork he dismissed as bureaucracy was documentation that protected us legally and ensured quality control. The oversight prevented costly mistakes. The wages were already competitive, and cutting profit margins while increasing costs was a guaranteed path to bankruptcy. Aggressive underbidding meant cutting corners, which led to safety issues and reputation damage. Kyle was essentially describing how to run a construction company into the ground within 18 months, but he thought it was innovative thinking that inherited rich kids were too privileged to understand. One of my site supervisors, Gerald, walked into the trailer and froze when he saw me sitting with Kyle. Gerald had worked for me for 11 years and definitely knew who I was. His eyes went wide, and he opened his mouth like he was about to say something, but I gave him a subtle headshake. Gerald caught on immediately, grabbed his lunch from the fridge, and left without saying a word. Kyle didn't notice the exchange because he was too busy explaining how construction companies should be run by people who'd actually done the work, rather than business school graduates who'd inherited their positions. The remaining framer at our table excused himself quickly, leaving just me and Kyle. Kyle barely registered his departure, too caught up in his manifesto about workplace inequality. He said the owner probably had no idea what materials actually cost or how long jobs realistically took, which led to unrealistic project timelines that put pressure on workers. I knew exactly what materials cost because I personally negotiated supplier contracts and reviewed every major purchase order. I knew how long jobs took because I'd done most of these jobs myself and regularly consulted with foremen about realistic scheduling. But Kyle had convinced himself that owners were fundamentally disconnected from operational reality. He started talking about his career goals, saying he wanted to work his way up to project management within 2 years. Kyle said he had the skills and knowledge, but knew he'd face resistance from an ownership structure that didn't value merit. I asked him what specific skills and knowledge he was referring to, and he listed off his 3 years of sporadic construction experience and a 2-year technical degree he'd completed mostly online. He seemed to think this limited background entitled him to rapid advancement, regardless of what he'd actually demonstrated in terms of performance or leadership ability. Kyle said the problem with construction was that promotions went to whoever had been there longest, rather than whoever was most talented, which he clearly believed was him. I asked Kyle if anyone had given him feedback about his performance since he'd started, and he said his crew lead had mentioned something about needing to focus more and take fewer breaks. But Kyle dismissed this as the guy being a hard ass. He said some people were just naturally better workers and didn't need to prove themselves through performative hustle. This was fascinating logic where taking excessive breaks and not focusing somehow demonstrated superior talent. Kyle asked me if my supervisor ever gave me grief about petty stuff, and I said I generally tried to follow workplace expectations and hadn't had any issues. Kyle said that was because I'd learned to play the game and keep my head down, whereas he refused to pretend rules made sense when they didn't. Kyle's phone buzzed and he checked it, then swore under his breath. He said his crew lead was texting, asking where he was because the afternoon concrete pour was starting and they needed everyone on deck. Kyle texted back that he was finishing lunch and would be there soon. He told me that management always created artificial urgency about everything, like the world would end if someone took an extra 15 minutes. I pointed out that concrete pours actually were time-sensitive and required coordinated crew timing, but Kyle waved this off. He said experienced workers knew how to make up time, and that constant pressure was just a control tactic to keep employees anxious and compliant. I asked Kyle what he thought about the specific project we were working on, a mixed-use development with retail on the ground floor and residential units above. He said it seemed straightforward enough, though he thought some of the structural specifications were overkill. Kyle believed the engineers had overdesigned certain elements to justify their fees, adding unnecessary cost and complexity. I knew those specifications had been carefully calculated for the seismic requirements in this region, and that cutting corners there would be illegal and dangerous. But Kyle apparently trusted his 3 years of limited experience over professional engineers with decades of expertise and legal liability. This kind of casual dismissal of safety standards terrified me because it suggested he might take unauthorized shortcuts if left unsupervised. Gerald walked back into the trailer, and this time approached our table directly. He looked at Kyle and said they needed him back at the pour site immediately because they were short-handed. Kyle sighed dramatically and said he'd be there in 5 minutes. Gerald's expression was tight, and I could tell he was barely containing his frustration. He glanced at me with a look that clearly communicated his opinion of Kyle's work ethic. After Gerald left, Kyle muttered that management always sent supervisors to nag people instead of just letting workers manage their own time. He said it was disrespectful and treated everyone like children who couldn't be trusted. The irony of complaining about being treated like a child while actively ignoring direct work assignments was apparently lost on him. Kyle finally stood up and gathered his lunch trash, still talking about the company and its inherited leadership. He said he'd probably start looking for a better position in a few months once he'd gained enough experience here to add to his resume. Kyle viewed jobs as temporary stepping stones where he extracted what he needed before moving on, never considering that his pattern of short tenures might signal reliability issues to future employers. He asked me if I planned to stick around long-term, and I said I was pretty committed to this company for the foreseeable future. Kyle said that was my choice but warned me not to expect loyalty in return because owners didn't care about workers beyond their immediate utility. He walked toward the door and then turned back to add one more thought. Kyle said that guys like us needed to stick together and not let management divide us with their hierarchies and favoritism. He said if I ever had issues with supervisors or felt disrespected, I should come talk to him because he wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. I thanked him for the offer and watched him leave, finally alone in the break area. I sat there for another minute finishing my coffee and processing the entire surreal conversation. Kyle had spent 40 minutes constructing an elaborate fantasy about my background and character while sitting 18 inches away from me, so convinced of his narrative that he'd never questioned it or noticed any contradictory evidence. I pulled out my phone and texted Gerald to meet me in the site office trailer in 15 minutes, then texted my HR director, Robin, to pull Kyle Brennan's employment file and join us. I spent those 15 minutes reviewing my mental notes from the conversation and considering how to handle this situation. Part of me was angry at Kyle's arrogant presumptions and disrespectful characterizations, but another part recognized that his attitude likely stemmed from insecurity and a need to blame external factors for his own shortcomings. Still, I couldn't ignore the safety concerns he'd raised about specifications being overkill or his pattern of extended breaks during time-sensitive operations. Gerald arrived at the office trailer looking stressed and apologetic. He started to explain that he'd tried to get Kyle back to work multiple times, but I held up a hand and told him it was fine. I asked Gerald for his, honest assessment of Kyle's performance over the past 2 weeks. Gerald didn't hold back. He said Kyle was consistently late returning from breaks, questioned every instruction, argued about safety protocols, and generally had a negative attitude that was affecting team morale. His actual work quality was mediocre at best, with Gerald having to correct his mistakes regularly. Gerald had been documenting everything in preparation for a performance review conversation, but was concerned that Kyle's attitude might not be fixable through coaching. Robin arrived with Kyle's file and her laptop. She sat down and pulled up his employment records while I reviewed the physical documents. Kyle's application had been impressive on paper with his technical degree and diverse experience across multiple companies, but his employment history showed a clear pattern of short tenures that should have raised red flags during the hiring process. His previous employers had given neutral references that confirmed dates but offered no substantive praise, which usually indicated problems they couldn't legally disclose. Kyle had been hired by a junior recruiter who'd apparently missed these warning signs, and our site supervisor had needed bodies quickly for the expansion project. I asked Robin about our probationary period policy, and she confirmed that new hires were evaluated at 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days, with termination possible at any point for performance or conduct issues. Kyle was only at day 14, which meant we had flexibility to address problems early. I told them both about the lunch conversation, giving them the highlights of Kyle's 40-minute lecture about what a privileged, inherited rich kid I was. Gerald's jaw dropped and Robin covered her mouth, both of them clearly shocked. Gerald said he'd seen Kyle talking to me but had no idea what they were discussing. Robin asked if I wanted to terminate him immediately for the disrespectful comments, but I said I wanted to handle this more deliberately. I told Robin to schedule a meeting with Kyle at 4 o'clock today in this trailer and to inform him it was a mandatory check-in regarding his first 2 weeks. I didn't want him to know the topic in advance or have time to prepare defenses. Gerald asked if he should be present, and I said yes, because I wanted his direct observations included in the conversation. Robin said she'd handle the notification and bring all necessary documentation. I spent the next hour reviewing the project timeline and talking to other crew members about Kyle's interactions with them. The feedback was consistently negative. Multiple workers mentioned that Kyle complained constantly, claimed he knew better than everyone else, and created tension within teams. At 4 o'clock, I was waiting in the office trailer when Robin arrived with Kyle. He looked confused and slightly annoyed at being pulled away from work again. Gerald came in right behind them and closed the door. Kyle sat down across from me and asked what this was about because he had work to finish before the end of shift. I let the silence hang for a moment before introducing myself properly. I stated my full name and title as founder and owner of the company, then watched Kyle's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally horror as he realized who he'd been talking to at lunch. The color drained completely from Kyle's face, and his mouth opened and closed silently. His hands gripped the edge of his chair, and I could see him mentally replaying our entire conversation, understanding for the first time who had been listening to his lecture about inherited privilege and disconnected ownership. I let him sit in that realization for a full 30 seconds before speaking. I told him I'd had a very educational lunch where I'd learned a lot about what one of my newest employees thought of my background, my work ethic, and my character. Kyle tried to stammer out an apology, but I held up my hand and said I wasn't interested in apologies right now. I was interested in facts and accountability. I asked Kyle to explain why he'd spent 40 minutes making detailed assumptions about someone he'd never met instead of focusing on his work and learning his job. He had no good answer, just more stammering about how he didn't realize and hadn't meant anything personal. I told him that was precisely the problem because it meant he regularly made sweeping judgments about people without information and felt entitled to share those judgments publicly. I asked him if he understood how that reflected on his professionalism and judgment. Kyle looked at his hands and mumbled that he'd made a mistake. I said it wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior that Gerald had been documenting since his first day. Gerald walked through the specific performance issues he'd observed, extended breaks during time-critical operations, questioning safety protocols, arguing with instructions, negative attitude affecting team morale, and below-average work quality requiring frequent correction. Each point was documented with dates and specific examples. Kyle tried to defend himself by saying he was still learning and that Gerald was being too rigid about minor issues. Gerald responded calmly that every other new hire managed to follow basic expectations without constant conflict, which suggested the issue was Kyle's approach rather than the job requirements. Robin added that his employment history showed a clear pattern of short tenures that typically indicated either personality conflicts or performance problems. I shifted to addressing the specific claims Kyle had made about me during lunch. I told him that I hadn't inherited this company or anything else because my father died when I was 19, leaving nothing but debt. I'd worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 4 years to save $12,000 to start this business. I'd slept in my truck for 18 months to minimize expenses. I'd done every single job in construction from cleanup crew to project management before I hired my first employee. I'd broken bones, damaged my hearing, and sacrificed relationships to build something from absolute zero. Every assumption Kyle had made about silver spoons and privilege was completely wrong, but he'd been so confident in his narrative that he'd never questioned it. Kyle's face was red now, and he looked genuinely ashamed. He said quietly that he'd had no idea and had just made assumptions. I told him that was exactly my point because making assumptions instead of seeking facts was a fundamental failure of judgment. I asked him about his comment that our structural specifications were overkill and engineers were just padding fees. Kyle looked confused that I knew about that, and I reminded him I'd been sitting right there when he said it. I explained that those specifications were legally required for seismic safety and that dismissing engineering standards after 3 years of sporadic experience was both arrogant and dangerous. Kyle tried to say he'd just been making conversation, but I told him that casual dismissal of safety protocols was grounds for immediate termination in my company. I asked Kyle why he'd returned late from multiple breaks during time-sensitive operations like the concrete pour today. He said he didn't think 15 extra minutes mattered that much and that workers deserved reasonable flexibility. I explained that concrete pours required precise timing and coordination because the material has a limited working window before it begins to cure. When one crew member is missing, it disrupts the entire operation and can compromise the structural integrity of the pour. His extended break today had forced other workers to cover his responsibilities and had stressed the timing on a critical foundation element. Kyle hadn't considered any of this because he'd been too focused on his perceived right to flexibility, regardless of operational impact. Gerald added that multiple team members had complained about Kyle's attitude and that his constant negativity was damaging morale. Workers didn't want to be around someone who spent every conversation complaining about management and claiming everything was done wrong. Gerald said that in 11 years with the company, he'd never had a new hire create this much friction this quickly. Robin noted that we'd received feedback from 3 separate crew members within Kyle's first week, which was unprecedented. They'd all mentioned his arrogance, his unwillingness to learn from experienced workers, and his habit of blaming others when his own work needed correction. I told Kyle that he was facing termination for cause based on performance issues, conduct problems, and safety concerns. His probationary period allowed us to make this decision at any time during the first 90 days. However, I was willing to offer him a choice because I believed people could learn from mistakes if they genuinely wanted to change. Option 1 was immediate termination with 0 severance and a reference that would only confirm his dates of employment. Option 2 was a formal written warning with a structured improvement plan that would last 30 days under close supervision. If he couldn't meet clearly defined standards during that period, he'd be terminated. If he could demonstrate real improvement, he'd continue past probation. Kyle looked up at me with something resembling hope and asked what the improvement plan would require. I told him it meant showing up on time, returning from breaks promptly, following all safety protocols without argument, accepting instruction from supervisors respectfully, maintaining a professional attitude with coworkers, and producing work quality that met minimum standards. These weren't extraordinary demands, just basic job expectations that every other employee managed to meet. Kyle would have weekly check-ins with Gerald to review progress, and any significant violation of safety protocols or disrespectful conduct would result in immediate termination, regardless of other improvements. I asked him to think carefully about whether he could realistically commit to those standards or if he'd be happier finding a different position. Kyle sat quietly for almost 2 minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision. I could see him calculating whether the embarrassment of staying was worse than the difficulty of job hunting with another short tenure on his record. Finally, he looked at me and said he wanted to take the improvement plan. He said he'd been wrong about everything and wanted a chance to prove he could do better. I asked him directly if he understood why his assumptions about me were both inaccurate and inappropriate. Kyle nodded and said he'd made judgments without information and had let his own frustrations create a story that wasn't based on reality. He said working multiple jobs to save money and sleeping in a truck showed the kind of dedication he'd never demonstrated himself. I told Kyle that I was giving him this opportunity because I remembered being young and stupid and convinced I knew everything. I'd made my own share of arrogant mistakes early in my career, though fortunately not directly to someone's face for 40 minutes. But I wanted him to understand that this was his only second chance. If he couldn't meet basic expectations over the next 30 days, we'd part ways permanently, and the reference would reflect that he'd been terminated during probation. Kyle said he understood and thanked me for the opportunity. Robin produced the written warning document and went through each point with Kyle, having him initial every section to confirm he understood the expectations and consequences. He signed it with a shaking hand. Gerald told Kyle to report to his crew tomorrow morning at 7 sharp and to be prepared for direct feedback throughout the day. He said they'd have a brief check-in every Friday to discuss progress. and Kyle should come to those meetings ready to talk about specific examples of improvements. Kyle nodded and asked if he could go, and I told him yes. After he left, the three of us sat in silence for a moment. Robin asked if I really thought he'd improve or if I'd just postponed the inevitable termination. I said honestly I wasn't sure, but I wanted to give him a genuine chance because sometimes humiliation could be a powerful teacher. Gerald said he'd keep close watch and wouldn't hesitate to document any continued problems. Over the following week, I made it a point to be visible on that job site more frequently. I introduced myself properly to workers I hadn't formally met and had brief conversations about their roles and any concerns they wanted to raise. The reactions varied from nervous to appreciative, but everyone seemed to understand that I was accessible and engaged with actual operations. I noticed Kyle keeping his head down and focusing on his work, avoiding eye contact whenever I was nearby. Gerald reported that Kyle's punctuality had improved, and he was being more respectful with instructions, though his work quality still needed development. The complaints from other crew members had stopped, suggesting his attitude had at least become less toxic. At the Friday check-in, Gerald told me that Kyle had shown genuine effort to improve but was still making technical mistakes that required supervision. His attendance and attitude were better, but his actual construction skills were weaker than his resume had suggested. Gerald thought with intensive mentoring Kyle might become an adequate worker, but probably wouldn't ever be the star performer he believed himself to be. I told Gerald to continue the close supervision and honest feedback. If Kyle could accept his current skill level and commit to learning, there might be a path forward. If his ego couldn't handle being corrected and mentored, he'd wash out on his own. By the end of 30 days, Kyle had made measurable improvements in punctuality, attitude, and willingness to follow instructions. His work quality was still below average, but had progressed enough that Gerald felt he could continue with standard supervision rather than constant oversight. Kyle passed his probationary review with clear documentation of areas needing continued development. I approved his progression to regular employee status, but noted in his file that he'd started with significant performance issues. During that review meeting, Kyle thanked me again for the second chance and said the experience had taught him important lessons about assumptions and humility. I told him that acknowledging mistakes was important, but sustained behavior change was what actually mattered. 3 months later, I was reviewing project reports when Gerald called to tell me that Kyle had put in his 2 weeks' notice. He'd accepted a position with a residential builder closer to his apartment. Gerald said Kyle's performance had plateaued at adequate but unexceptional, and that he'd probably realized this company wasn't going to fast-track him to project management based on entitlement rather than demonstrated capability. I told Gerald to process the resignation professionally and thanked him for his patience with a difficult employee. Kyle's departure was probably best for everyone, since he'd clearly never be satisfied with the pace of advancement his actual performance merited. On Kyle's last day, he stopped by the main office and asked if he could speak with me briefly. I had 15 minutes before a meeting and told him to come in. Kyle stood awkwardly in my doorway and said he wanted to apologize properly for that lunch conversation and for his attitude during his first weeks. He said the experience had been humbling and had forced him to reconsider how he approached work and evaluated other people. Kyle admitted he'd had similar issues at previous jobs and had always blamed management rather than looking at his own contributions to the problems. He said he wasn't sure he'd fully fixed those patterns yet, but at least he was aware of them now. I told him that self-awareness was the first step toward real growth and wished him well in his next position. After Kyle left, I thought about the entire strange situation and what it revealed about perception versus reality. Kyle had constructed an elaborate narrative about inherited privilege that allowed him to excuse his own mediocre performance and dismiss legitimate feedback as unfair bias. The lunch conversation had been absurd, but the underlying pattern was common. People often created stories that protected their self-image rather than confronting uncomfortable truths about their own limitations. I'd given Kyle a chance to break that pattern, and while he'd made some progress, I suspected he'd ultimately revert to old habits once the immediate consequences faded. Some people learned from humiliation, and others just learned to hide their attitudes better. 6 months after Kyle left, I heard through industry contacts that he'd already moved to another company after a brief tenure with the residential builder. The pattern continued. I never heard from him directly again, but occasionally wondered if he'd ever told anyone about the time he'd spent 40 minutes explaining to his boss how the boss had inherited everything and never earned anything. It would make a good cautionary tale about assumptions and arrogance, though I doubted Kyle would tell the story that way. More likely, he'd reframed it as another example of management being unreasonable rather than acknowledging his own failures. I'd learned that some people were committed to their narratives regardless of evidence, and sometimes the best you could do was remove them from your organization before they damaged morale too severely. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.